Imagine waking up in a world where everything you knew has been obliterated. Your city is rubble. Your currency is worthless. Foreign soldiers patrol your streets. This was Germany in May 1945. But what you're about to discover is a story rarely told completely. A story of survival, transformation, and rebirth that would reshape the entire world order. In just 4 decades, a defeated nation split in two would rise from the ashes to become an economic powerhouse. But the journey was anything but simple. Stay with me, because what really happened to Germany after World War II is far more complex, dramatic, and surprising than you ever learned in school. May 8th, 1945. The guns finally fell silent across Europe. Nazi Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Adolf Hitler was dead. The Third Reich, which was supposed to last 1,000 years, had collapsed after just 12. But as one nightmare ended, another was about to begin for the German people. Before we dive into what happened after the war, we need to understand what Germany looked like at this moment in history. The nation that had once been a powerful European state was now completely broken. Over 7 million German soldiers and civilians had died. Cities were destroyed. The economy had ceased to function. And perhaps most importantly, Germany was about to lose its sovereignty entirely. 3 powers now controlled Germany's fate: the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. France would join them later. These victorious allies had already been planning Germany's future for years, but they had very different visions for what that future should look like, and those differences would literally tear the country in half. Before we explore how Germany became 2 nations, how millions suffered, how some prospered, and how eventually one of history's most dramatic reunifications occurred, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. We dive deep into the stories history books skip over, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Germans call it Stunde Null, 0 hour, the moment when everything reset to nothing, and they weren't exaggerating. Let me paint you a picture of Germany in the summer of 1945 because the scale of destruction is almost incomprehensible. 20% of all German housing had been destroyed. In major cities, that number was much higher. In Cologne, 70% of the city was rubble. In Hamburg, 55%. Berlin, the capital, was a moonscape of destruction. 3.6 million homes were simply gone. Imagine that. Millions of people with no roof over their heads. People lived in cellars, in bombed-out buildings, in shelters made from rubble. They called these women and children who cleared the ruins Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women. Millions of German men were dead or imprisoned, so it fell to women to literally dig their cities out of the ruins, one brick at a time. But physical destruction was only part of the catastrophe. Germany's economy had completely collapsed. The Reichsmark was essentially worthless. There were no jobs because there were no functioning businesses. Food was desperately scarce. The average caloric intake in cities had dropped to below 1,000 calories per day, less than half of what a person needs to survive. The black market became the real economy. People traded possessions for food, a grandmother's silver for a loaf of bread, a family heirloom for a pound of butter. American cigarettes became currency, more valuable than money. One cigarette could buy you a meal, a carton could buy you almost anything, and then there was the political reality. Germany, as an independent nation, had ceased to exist. The Allied powers divided the country into 4 occupation zones. The Soviets controlled the East. The Americans, British, and French controlled the West, split among them. Berlin, though deep inside the Soviet zone, was also divided 4 ways. Each occupying power had its own approach. The Soviets began systematically dismantling factories and shipping them back to Russia as reparations. Entire industrial plants were taken apart piece by piece and transported east. The Western Allies were more measured, but they too had plans for permanent deindustrialization. The Morgenthau Plan, proposed by US Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, suggested turning Germany into an agricultural nation incapable of ever waging war again. Germans call it Stunde Null, 0 hour, the moment when everything reset to nothing. And they weren't exaggerating. Let me paint you a picture of Germany in the summer of 1945, because the scale of destruction is almost incomprehensible. 20% of all German housing had been destroyed. In major cities, that number was much higher. In Cologne, 70% of the city was rubble. In Hamburg, 55%. Berlin, the capital, was a moonscape of destruction. 3.6 million homes were simply gone. Imagine that. Millions of people with no roof over their heads. People lived in cellars, in bombed-out buildings, in shelters made from rubble. They called these women and children who cleared the ruins Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women. Millions of German men were dead or imprisoned, so it fell to women to literally dig their cities out of the ruins, one brick at a time. But physical destruction was only part of the catastrophe. Germany's economy had completely collapsed. The Reichsmark was essentially worthless. There were no jobs because there were no functioning businesses. Food was desperately scarce. The average caloric intake in cities had dropped to below 1,000 calories per day, less than half of what a person needs to survive. The black market became the real economy. People traded possessions for food, a grandmother's silver for a loaf of bread, a family heirloom for a pound of butter. American cigarettes became currency, more valuable than money. One cigarette could buy you a meal, a carton could buy you almost anything. And then there was the political reality. Germany as an independent nation had ceased to exist. The Allied powers divided the country into 4 occupation zones. The Soviets controlled the East. The Americans, British, and French controlled the West, split among them. Berlin, though deep inside the Soviet zone, was also divided 4 ways. Each occupying power had its own approach. The Soviets began systematically dismantling factories and shipping them back to Russia as reparations. Entire industrial plants were taken apart piece by piece and transported east. The Western Allies were more measured, but they too had plans for permanent deindustrialization. The Morgenthau Plan, proposed by US Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, suggested turning Germany into an agricultural nation incapable of ever waging war again. By 1947, it was becoming painfully obvious that the Allied partnership that had defeated Hitler was falling apart. Winston Churchill gave his famous Iron Curtain speech. The United States announced the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. The Cold War wasn't coming, it had arrived, and Germany was about to become its central battleground. The Marshall Plan changed everything for Western Germany. Officially called the European Recovery Program, it was a massive American economic aid package designed to rebuild Western Europe. Between 1948 and 1952, West Germany received approximately $1.4 billion in aid. That's equivalent to over $17 billion today. But the Marshall Plan wasn't just about money, it came with conditions. Recipients had to agree to economic cooperation, reduce trade barriers, and create stable democratic governments. The Soviets were actually offered Marshall Plan aid too, but Stalin refused it and forbade Eastern European nations under Soviet control from accepting it. This decision would have profound consequences for East Germany. In June 1948, the Western Allies did something dramatic. They introduced a new currency in their zones, the Deutsche Mark. Overnight, the worthless Reichsmark was replaced. Every person received 40 new marks. Savings were converted at a rate of 100 old marks to 6.5 new marks. It was a controversial move that wiped out savings, but also wiped out the black market. The results were almost magical. Within days, shop windows that had been empty for years were suddenly full of goods. Merchants who had been hoarding products, unwilling to accept worthless currency, suddenly had reason to sell. The economy began functioning again almost immediately. It was the first step toward what would become known as the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. The architect of this miracle was Ludwig Erhard, who would later become West Germany's chancellor. His philosophy was simple: social market economy. Not pure capitalism, but not socialism either. A free market with a social safety net, competition with compassion. It would become the model for modern Germany. The Berlin blockade. But Stalin wasn't about to let the Western Allies gain such an advantage without a fight. When the Western Allies introduced the Deutsche Mark, Stalin responded with one of the most dramatic gambits of the early Cold War, the Berlin blockade. On June 24, 1948, Soviet forces cut off all road, rail, and water access to West Berlin. Remember, Berlin was deep inside the Soviet-controlled zone of Germany. The Western-controlled sectors of Berlin were an island surrounded by Soviet territory. Stalin calculated that by starving West Berlin into submission, he could force the Western Allies out entirely. The Western Allies faced a choice: abandon West Berlin to Soviet control or fight their way through, risking a war. Instead, they chose a third option that seemed almost impossible. They would supply 2.5 million West Berliners entirely by air. The Berlin airlift began. At its peak, a plane was landing in West Berlin every 30 seconds, 24 hours a day. C-47s, C-54s, and British aircraft flew in everything: food, coal, medicine, even candy for children. Pilots became heroes. West Berliners watched the skies with hope. For 318 days, the airlift continued. Over 200,000 flights delivered more than 2 million tons of supplies. It was an incredible logistical achievement and a powerful propaganda victory. Stalin finally lifted the blockade in May 1949, but by then, the division of Germany was effectively permanent. Two Germanys are born. On May 23, 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, was officially established. Its capital would be Bonn, a small city on the Rhine. The new constitution, called the Basic Law, created a parliamentary democracy with strong protections for individual rights. Konrad Adenauer became the first chancellor. The Soviets responded 5 months later. On October 7, 1949, they established the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, in their zone. Despite its name, there was nothing democratic about it. It would be a one-party communist state, firmly under Soviet control. East Berlin became its capital. And just like that, one nation became two. Two Germanys with two competing systems, two ideologies, two economies, and two visions for the future. For the next 40 years, they would develop in radically different directions, and the story of those differences reveals some profound truths about political and economic systems. The economic miracle in the West. The 1950s in West Germany were extraordinary. The economy grew at an average rate of 8% per year. Unemployment, which had been over 10% in 1950, dropped below 1% by 1960. Wages doubled. The standard of living improved dramatically. There were several reasons for this miracle. First, despite the destruction, Germany still had something crucial: skilled workers. German engineers, technicians, and craftsmen were among the best in the world. Second, the Marshall Plan provided crucial capital and opened American markets to German goods. Third, Ludwig Erhard's economic reforms created a business-friendly environment, but there was another factor that's often overlooked: the Gastarbeiter, or guest workers. As West Germany's economy boomed, it faced labor shortages. The solution was to recruit workers from Southern Europe and Turkey. Millions came, taking jobs in factories, construction, and services. They were temporary guests who often became permanent residents, adding to West Germany's diversity. West German products became synonymous with quality. Mercedes automobiles, Siemens electronics, BASF chemicals, made in Germany, went from being a stigma to being a mark of excellence. Exports soared. By the 1960s, West Germany had become the world's second largest exporter after the United States. For ordinary West Germans, life improved year by year. People moved from cellars and temporary housing into modern apartments. Families bought refrigerators, washing machines, and eventually televisions. The dream of owning a car became reality for millions. It was a complete transformation in just 15 years. Life in East Germany. Meanwhile, across the border in East Germany, the story was very different. The German Democratic Republic portrayed itself as an anti-fascist workers' paradise, building socialism under the guidance of the Socialist Unity Party. The reality was far bleaker. East Germany started at a significant disadvantage. The Soviets had stripped the eastern zone bare, while the Western Allies eventually stopped taking reparations and focused on rebuilding. Stalin demanded payment in blood. Entire factories were dismantled and shipped to the Soviet Union. Railway tracks were torn up. Industrial equipment, machinery, even entire power plants vanished eastward. The economic model imposed on East Germany was Soviet-style central planning. The state owned everything. 5-year plans dictated production targets. Competition was eliminated, innovation was discouraged, and the results were predictable. While West Germany's economy soared, East Germany struggled to provide basic necessities. But the differences went far beyond economics. East Germany was a surveillance state. The Stasi, the secret police, would eventually employ over 90,000 full-time officers and hundreds of thousands of informants. Neighbors spied on neighbors, children informed on parents. Speaking freely could land you in prison. Wanting to leave the country was considered treason, and people did want to leave. By 1961, over 3 million East Germans had fled to the west, most through Berlin, where the border was still somewhat porous. They were voting with their feet, and the message was clear. The socialist paradise wasn't working. The brain drain was devastating. Doctors, engineers, teachers, skilled workers all headed west for freedom and opportunity. The East German government hemorrhaged its best and brightest. Something had to be done to stop the exodus. And in August 1961, they did something that would become one of the most infamous symbols of the Cold War. The Berlin Wall, August 13th, 1961. Berliners woke up to find their city being divided by barbed wire. Within days, the barbed wire became concrete. Within months, the concrete became a fortified barrier with guard towers, searchlights, and soldiers ordered to shoot anyone trying to cross. The Berlin Wall wasn't built to keep people out, it was built to keep people in. Walter Ulbricht, the East German leader, called it an anti-fascist protection rampart. The rest of the world knew what it really was, a prison wall, the ultimate admission that the communist system could only survive by force. The wall stretched for 96 miles around West Berlin. It divided families. Parents were separated from children, husbands from wives. People who lived on one side of the street couldn't visit friends on the other. Windows facing West Berlin were bricked up. Buildings along the wall were demolished to create a death strip, and people still tried to escape. They dug tunnels, they jumped from buildings, they crashed through checkpoints and trucks, they hid in car trunks and secret compartments, they built hot air balloons. Some succeeded, many failed. At least 140 people were killed trying to cross the Berlin Wall. The true number is probably higher. For 28 years, the wall stood as a physical manifestation of the Iron Curtain. It became a symbol of communist oppression and Cold War division. Presidents visited it. Ronald Reagan would stand before it and demand, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." But in 1961, nobody imagined it would ever come down. Most assumed the division of Germany was permanent. West Germany's transformation. While East Germany stagnated behind its wall, West Germany continued its remarkable transformation. By the 1960s, the economic miracle was in full swing, but the transformation wasn't just economic. West Germany was wrestling with its past and trying to build a genuinely democratic society. The first generation of West German leaders were conservatives who sometimes preferred to forget the Nazi past. But the younger generation, born during or just after the war, began asking uncomfortable questions. What did you do during the war, father? How could this have happened? Why did so few resist? The 1960s saw student protests, not just against the Vietnam War like in America, but against what young Germans saw as their parents' generation's failure to confront the Nazi past. The Auschwitz trials of 1963 to 1965 forced Germany to look at the Holocaust directly. 22 defendants, guards, and officials from Auschwitz faced justice. The testimony was harrowing. The details were published. Germany could no longer look away. This reckoning with the past became a defining feature of West German identity. Unlike in East Germany, where the communist government declared all the Nazis had fled to the West and refused to accept any responsibility, West Germany began accepting moral accountability. It wasn't easy. It wasn't complete, but it was happening. In 1970, West German Chancellor Willy Brandt did something extraordinary. During a visit to Poland, he knelt before the memorial to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. It was an unscripted gesture of atonement and apology. Some Germans thought it was too much, others thought it was insufficient, but it signaled that West Germany was willing to face its history. Brandt also pioneered Ostpolitik, a new policy toward Eastern Europe and East Germany. Instead of refusing to recognize East Germany's existence, Brandt sought engagement. He believed that change could come through contact, through small steps, through recognizing reality while working toward eventual reunification. The policy was controversial. Conservatives accused him of selling out, but Ostpolitik opened communication channels. It allowed families divided by the wall to visit each other. It created economic ties, and it planted seeds that would bear fruit decades later. Life on both sides. By the 1970s and 1980s, the contrast between the two Germanys was stark. West Germany was one of the world's wealthiest nations. Its citizens enjoyed political freedom, economic prosperity, and a high standard of living. They traveled freely, consumed global culture, and participated in a vibrant democracy. East Germany, meanwhile, remained trapped in stagnation. The economy limped along, producing goods that nobody wanted to buy. Consumer products were scarce and shoddy. Cars like the Trabant became symbols of socialist inefficiency. Made largely of plastic and outdated technology, they produced clouds of two-stroke exhaust and broke down constantly. Yet East Germans waited years to buy one. The regime tried to create socialist culture and identity. They built massive housing blocks, standardized apartment complexes that looked identical whether in East Berlin, Moscow, or Budapest. They promoted socialist realist art. They celebrated workers' solidarity. They insisted that life in the East was superior to the corrupt capitalist West, but East Germans could watch West German television. The signals crossed the border. They could see advertisements for products they'd never have. They could watch news without censorship. They could compare their lives to their Western cousins and draw their own conclusions. This created a strange reality. East Germans lived in a system that insisted it was superior while being able to see that it clearly wasn't. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Some retreated into private life, creating small spaces of freedom in their apartments, their gardens, their friendships. Others conformed outwardly while dreaming of escape. The East German government tried to buy stability. They subsidized rents and basic goods. Nobody would starve. Nobody would be homeless. There was a kind of cradle-to-grave security, but there was also suffocating control. The state watched everything. Dissent was crushed, and the economy was slowly collapsing under the weight of its own inefficiencies. The Soviet Empire cracks. By the mid-1980s, the entire communist bloc was in crisis. The Soviet Union, which had propped up East Germany and other satellite states for decades, was itself struggling. Its economy was failing. Its war in Afghanistan was a disaster. Its political system was ossified. Then came Mikhail Gorbachev. The new Soviet leader recognized that the system was broken. He introduced glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. He told the communist leaders of Eastern Europe that Soviet tanks would no longer enforce their rule. They were on their own. This was revolutionary. For 40 years, the threat of Soviet intervention had kept communist governments in power. In 1953, Soviet tanks had crushed an uprising in East Germany. In 1956, they had invaded Hungary. In 1968, they had crushed the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia. The message had been clear. Reform was impossible, the system was permanent, but now Gorbachev was saying something different. The old rules no longer applied, and across Eastern Europe, people began testing the boundaries. In Poland, the Solidarity movement gained strength. In Hungary, reformers began dismantling border fences. In Czechoslovakia, dissidents grew bolder. East Germany's leaders, old communist hardliners, watched these developments with horror. They had no intention of reforming. Erich Honecker, who had led East Germany since 1971, insisted that the Berlin Wall would stand for another 100 years. He banned Soviet publications that discussed glasnost. He increased repression, but he couldn't stop the tide of history. The world was changing, and East Germany, that artificial creation born of Cold War division, was about to be swept away. Act 4, The Fall, 1989, the year everything changed. 1989 began like any other year in divided Germany. The wall still stood. The border remained closed. Few people imagined that within 12 months everything would change, but beneath the surface, pressure was building. Throughout the spring and summer, East Germans began fleeing through an unexpected route. Hungary had begun dismantling its border fence with Austria. East Germans traveled to Hungary as tourists, then crossed into Austria and from there to West Germany. Thousands took this route. The East German government was helpless to stop them. Others sought refuge in West German embassies in Prague and Warsaw. Hundreds, then thousands of East Germans crowded into embassy compounds, refusing to leave until they were granted passage to the West. The images were powerful. Desperate people climbing fences, camping in embassy gardens, demanding freedom. Back in East Germany, protest movements grew. It started in Leipzig, where every Monday, protesters gathered at Nikolaikirche for prayers, then marched through the streets. Wir sind das Volk, they chanted. We are the people. At first, dozens participated, then hundreds, then thousands. The regime didn't know how to respond. Use force and risk another Tiananmen Square? The Chinese government had just massacred protesters in Beijing that June. Would East Germans accept such brutality, or would it spark revolution? On October 7th, 1989, East Germany celebrated its 40th anniversary. Mikhail Gorbachev attended the ceremonies in Berlin. Protesters hoped he would support them. The government hoped he would endorse their hard line. Instead, he delivered a warning disguised as advice. Life punishes those who come too late, he said. 2 days later, on October 9th, 70,000 people marched in Leipzig. The police and army were deployed. Weapons were ready. The protest leaders expected violence. They prepared for the worst. But the order to shoot never came. Local party officials, perhaps sensing which way the wind was blowing, decided not to massacre their own people. The dam had broken. If 70,000 people could march in Leipzig without consequence, anything was possible. The next Monday, 120,000 marched. The Monday after that, 300,000. The protests spread to Berlin, Dresden, and other cities. The government was paralyzed. On October 18th, Erich Honecker resigned. He was replaced by Egon Krenz, another hardliner who tried to promise reforms while changing nothing fundamental. Nobody believed him. The protests continued. The pressure mounted. The night the wall fell, November 9th, 1989, a date that would echo through history. That afternoon, the East German government held a press conference to announce new travel regulations. Citizens could apply for exit visas. The rules were complex and unclear. They were supposed to take effect the next day, but Günther Schabowski, the party official announcing the new rules, hadn't been properly briefed. When a journalist asked when the new regulations would take effect, Schabowski shuffled through his papers, looked confused, and said, "As far as I know, no, immediately, without delay." That answer, broadcast live on television, changed everything. East Germans heard it and believed the borders were open. Thousands headed to the border crossings in Berlin. They demanded to be let through. The guards had no instructions. They called their superiors. Nobody knew what to do. At checkpoint after checkpoint, the same scene played out. Crowds growing, guards nervous, pressure building. Finally, at Bornholmer Strasse, the crossing point commander made a decision. He couldn't hold back the crowd. At 10:30 p.m., he ordered the gates opened. The floodgates opened literally and figuratively. Tens of thousands of East Berliners poured through the checkpoints. They were met by West Berliners with champagne and flowers. Strangers embraced. People wept with joy. They climbed on top of the wall and danced. They took hammers and chisels and began physically dismantling the barrier that had divided them for 28 years. The images broadcast around the world were stunning. Young people sitting on the wall, swinging champagne bottles. The famous news anchor Tom Brokaw broadcasting live from Berlin, struggling to contain his emotion. The sense that history was happening in real time. But this wasn't just about Berlin. This was the beginning of the end of the Cold War. Within weeks, communist governments across Eastern Europe would fall. The Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, the overthrow of Ceausescu in Romania, the Soviet Empire was collapsing. For Germany, the question was no longer if reunification would happen, but how and when. Most observers assumed it would take years, maybe a decade. The two systems were so different. The economic disparities were enormous. Surely a gradual, careful process was necessary. They underestimated both the desire for unity and the momentum of events. Chancellor Helmut Kohl of West Germany saw the opportunity and moved quickly. He proposed a 10-point plan for confederation and eventual reunification. The East German government, weak and discredited, had little choice but to negotiate. ACT 5: Reunification and Legacy. The path to unity. The first democratic elections in East Germany took place in March 1990. The people voted overwhelmingly for parties supporting rapid reunification. The message was clear. After 40 years of division, Germans wanted to be one nation again, but reunification wasn't simple. The two Germanys had completely different legal systems, economic systems, currencies, and institutions. How do you merge a communist command economy with a capitalist market economy? How do you integrate two different legal codes? What about property that had been nationalized or confiscated? And then there were the international dimensions. Germany had been divided by the victors of World War II. The Allied powers still technically had rights regarding Germany's status. Would the Soviet Union really allow a reunified Germany? Would it have to be neutral, forbidden from joining NATO? Helmut Kohl negotiated brilliantly. He reassured the Soviets with economic aid. Germany would help pay for the withdrawal of Soviet troops. He reassured Poland and other neighbors that Germany's borders were final. No territorial claims would be made. He reassured NATO allies that a united Germany would remain part of the Western Alliance. The diplomatic breakthrough came in July 1990 with the so-called 2+4 agreement. The two Germanys plus the four Allied powers agreed on the terms of reunification. Germany would be fully sovereign, Soviet troops would withdraw, Germany could join NATO. The borders were final, the war was officially over. On July 1st, 1990, the two German currencies merged. East Germans could exchange their Ostmarks for Deutsche Marks at a favorable rate. Overnight, East German savings accounts contained Western currency. It was both generous and economically risky. The West German mark was strong. The East German economy was weak. Could it survive the shock of instant integration? The answer was no, not without massive support. When the monetary union took effect, East German products immediately became uncompetitive. Why buy a plastic Trabant when you could now afford a real car? Why buy shoddy East German electronics when you could have quality Western goods? East German factories closed by the thousands. Unemployment soared. Entire industries collapsed. The scale of economic devastation was stunning. Over 4 million jobs disappeared. Entire communities built around single factories or industries were wiped out. The German government responded with massive transfers of wealth from west to east. Over $2 trillion would be spent on reunification over the next 3 decades. New roads, new telecommunications, new infrastructure, pensions and unemployment benefits, retraining programs. It was the largest peacetime transfer of wealth in human history. October 3rd, 1990, the day of German unity. At midnight, the German Democratic Republic ceased to exist. Its 5 states were incorporated into the Federal Republic of Germany. After 45 years of division, Germany was one nation again. In Berlin, over 1 million people gathered for celebrations. The bell of unity rang. Fireworks exploded over the Brandenburg Gate. Politicians gave speeches about a new beginning. Germans from East and West celebrated together, though some East Germans felt ambivalent. They were happy for freedom and unity, but they also mourned the loss of their identity, their biographies, everything they had known. The next day, the hard work began. Reunification on paper was one thing. Reunification in practice was far more complicated. Everything in the former East Germany had to be transformed. The legal system, the education system, the healthcare system, the police and military, government bureaucracies, even street names. Property ownership was a nightmare. What about property confiscated by the Nazis, by the Soviets, by the East German government? What about property where the original owners had fled or died, where records had been destroyed? The legal battles would continue for decades. Then there was the Stasi legacy. The secret police had kept files on millions of East Germans, detailed reports on people's private lives, their conversations, their secrets. Informant networks that included friends, neighbors, even family members. What should be done with these files? Germany made a remarkable decision. The files would be opened. People could read their own files and discover who had informed on them. It was traumatic. People discovered that their spouse had been an informant, that their best friend had reported on them, that their trusted colleague had betrayed them. Families were destroyed. Friendships ended. But Germany chose truth over forgetting. The Stasi Records Agency employed thousands of people to manage the files, process requests, and support those hurt by what they discovered. It was a model for other post-authoritarian societies dealing with secret police legacies. Painful, yes, but necessary for healing and accountability. The long reunification. The euphoria of 1990 eventually gave way to the hard reality of integration. Despite massive investments, the economic gap between East and West persisted. Wages in the East remained lower, unemployment remained higher. Young people left for opportunities in the West, draining the East of talent and energy. Some East Germans felt like second-class citizens in their own country. Their qualifications and work experience were often devalued. Their biographies were treated as irrelevant or even suspicious. Everything from the West was assumed to be better. Everything from the East was dismissed or mocked. This feeling gave rise to what Germans call Ostalgie, nostalgia for the East. Not for the Stasi or the oppression, but for the sense of community, the social security, the simpler life. Some even claimed life had been better before, though this was often selective memory. Meanwhile, some West Germans grew resentful of the solidarity tax they paid to fund Eastern reconstruction. They felt taken for granted. They asked why they should continue paying for people who sometimes seemed ungrateful. These tensions were real and persist even today, more than 3 decades after reunification. In some ways, the wall in people's heads has proven harder to demolish than the wall of concrete and barbed wire, but it's also important to recognize how much has been achieved. The East has been rebuilt, infrastructure is modern, cities like Dresden and Leipzig are thriving, a new generation has grown up knowing only unified Germany. The economic gap has narrowed, though not disappeared. Germany has become Europe's economic engine and a model of how to confront historical guilt while building a democratic future. The country that perpetrated the Holocaust has become one of the most committed defenders of human rights. The nation that started 2 world wars has become a champion of international cooperation and European integration. This transformation didn't happen by accident. It happened because Germans, particularly in the West, made conscious choices to face their history, to build democratic institutions, to integrate with Europe, and to reject nationalism. When reunification came, these choices shaped how it unfolded. Lessons and legacy. So what can we learn from Germany's post-war experience? What does this remarkable story of division and reunification teach us? First, that systems matter. The contrast between East and West Germany was essentially a controlled experiment in political and economic systems. 2 populations with the same language, culture, and history, divided by ideology. One system produced prosperity, freedom, and innovation. The other produced stagnation, oppression, and eventual collapse. The verdict of history is clear. Second, that confronting the past, however painful, is necessary for a healthy future. West Germany's willingness to face the Holocaust and the Nazi period, to accept responsibility and make amends, was crucial to its democratic development. East Germany's refusal to do so left a moral void that undermined its legitimacy. Third, that integration is harder than it looks. Reunification seemed like it should be straightforward. They spoke the same language, they shared history, but 40 years of separation had created different mentalities, different expectations, different experiences. Overcoming these differences required time, patience, and enormous resources. Fourth, that freedom matters. When given the choice, millions of East Germans chose freedom over security, opportunity over comfort, uncertainty over predictability. The wall fell not because of military pressure or diplomatic maneuvering, but because ordinary people demanded their rights and their dignity. Germany's story after World War II is ultimately a story about choices. The choice to help rather than punish, exemplified by the Marshall Plan. The choice to face the past rather than deny it. The choice to build democratic institutions and defend them. The choice to integrate with Europe rather than retreat into nationalism. And finally, the choice to reunify rapidly rather than postpone the difficulties. Not all these choices were easy. Not all the outcomes were perfect. Germany today still grapples with the legacy of division. Economic disparities persist. Political differences remain. The rise of right-wing populism in some parts of the former East Germany shows that reunification is still a work in progress, but the overall arc is unmistakable. From the ruins of 1945, from the division of 1949, from the oppression of the Cold War, Germany has emerged as a prosperous, democratic, and peaceful nation. It has contributed to European unity rather than threatening it. It has become a force for good in the world rather than a source of devastation. This transformation remains one of the most remarkable national stories of the 20th century, and it reminds us that nations, like people, can change, that the mistakes and crimes of the past, however terrible, do not determine the future, that with the right choices, the right institutions, and the right values, redemption is possible. From the ashes of total defeat to economic powerhouse, from moral devastation to democratic model, from a nation divided by walls and barbed wire to a unified country at the heart of Europe. Germany's journey after World War II is a testament to human resilience, the power of democratic institutions, and the possibility of genuine transformation. The rubble women who cleared the ruins brick by brick, the leaders who chose cooperation over revenge, the protesters who demanded freedom despite the risks, the ordinary people on both sides who built new lives from nothing. They all played a part in this incredible story. Today, when you visit Berlin, you can still see remnants of the wall preserved as monuments. You can visit the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, a stark reminder of why this history matters. You can see a vibrant, multicultural city that has become one of Europe's creative and intellectual centers. The transformation is complete, yet the memory remains. Germany's post-war story reminds us that history is not predetermined, that nations can learn from catastrophic mistakes, that peace and prosperity are possible even after the darkest chapters, and that the choices we make today shape the world our children will inherit. But Germany wasn't the only nation transformed by World War II's aftermath. Across the Pacific, another defeated nation was undergoing its own dramatic rebirth under American occupation. From atomic devastation to technological superpower, Japan's post-war transformation followed a very different path with equally fascinating results. If you want to understand how the modern world was shaped by the aftermath of World War II, you need to hear that story too. Subscribe to The Deep Unknown so you don't miss it. We dig into the history that shapes our present, the stories that textbooks skip, and the truths that help us understand how we got here. And if you found this story compelling, check out our video on the Berlin Wall's complete history, from construction to collapse, or watch our deep dive into the Marshall Plan and how American aid rebuilt Europe. The links are in the description. History isn't just about the past, it's about understanding why the world works the way it does today. And sometimes the most important lessons come from the darkest chapters. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.